Anomalous observation. In the basement of a small laboratory on the outskirts of the city, the latest experiment was quietly progressing, completely unnoticed by the outside world. This experiment, conducted in a sealed space where no information could leak to the outside, aimed to observe interdimensional space. The scientists were exploring ways to transcend the walls of dimensions, constantly pushing the limits. Their goal was to observe an unknown world. It wasn't about opening a door to another dimension, it was about confirming its existence. On that day, the experiment had reached a particularly critical stage. The observation device had finally captured an abnormal signal. This meant that the existence of another dimension had been confirmed. "We did it," Chief Researcher Tajima spoke, his eyes shining with excitement. But those words soon stuck in his chest like a thorn. The signal from the other dimension wasn't just data. It was sound. Neither the cold voice of a machine nor mere noise. It was a voice from some living existence. The content implied by that voice emitted an eerie sensation, as if it could see right through to this side. "Tajima-san, this isn't right," the young researcher Sato said fearfully. "It's showing an abnormal pattern." "What do you mean? It's not a signal from our side. It looks like data being transmitted from the other dimension. And it feels like something is deliberately observing us." For a moment, Tajima felt a shiver run down his spine, but he quickly regained his composure. "There's a hypothesis that living beings might exist in other dimensions. This is the proof." Sato remained silent for a moment, then stared at the monitor again. "But, doesn't it feel like it's clearly trying to talk to us?" "Maybe so. But so what?" Tajima wasn't ignoring Sato's concern. But the scientific value of making contact with another dimension overwhelmed his sense of fear. At that moment, the signal displayed on the monitor suddenly changed. The initially quiet sound gradually turned into a piercingly sharp noise, and the atmosphere instantly felt heavier. "Tajima-san, this is bad," Sato shouted. "Something is coming toward us." Before he could finish his sentence, the entire lab began to shake violently. The floor cracked, the ceiling began to crumble, and the walls started to distort. Tajima could do nothing but stare wide-eyed at the scene before him. Countless cables and devices sparked, while the monitor in front of him streamed data at an abnormal speed. Even so, he could definitely feel something approaching. Electricity was being consumed at an extraordinary rate, and the observation device had begun to run wildly out of control. "An interdimensional being is interfering with us," Tajima muttered, trembling, but he felt those words echo emptily. As he witnessed the abnormal movements of the equipment within the lab, Tajima couldn't help but recall a certain memory. Several years ago, back when the observation device was still in the design stage, he had presented his first hypothesis about other dimensions at an international conference. At that time, the majority of researchers sneered and opposed him. But his intuition had not been wrong. The existence of interdimensional space could be proven. And now, the conviction that there was a way to observe it had taken shape. However, in this very moment, he felt that this might not be something to celebrate. The monitor blinked red, and the voice from the other dimension echoed ever more ominously. This time, a low, whispering sound like that of a human voice began to flow. It was not something understandable as language, but for some reason, its resonance evoked a primal fear. "Can you hear me?" Tajima instinctively raised his voice. Sato, drenched in cold sweat, stared into the monitor. "This is definitely intentional. Someone is speaking to us. But something's not right. Why?" Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped rapidly. The chill seeped deep into their bones. The inside of the lab felt as though it were being drawn into another dimension, filling with a chilling air. "This is abnormal. Something is wrong." Unable to endure the cold sensation at his feet, Tajima looked around. Everything appeared distorted. The walls of the lab seemed to stretch and shrink, and the desks and chairs flickered as if teleporting. "Tajima-san," Sato's voice trembled. "If this really is from another dimension, then what we're seeing is no longer reality." At that moment, a sound like an explosion echoed through the room. Part of the lab collapsed, and a large crack appeared in the wall. But it wasn't just a sound of destruction. It sounded as if space itself was being torn apart. "Run!" Tajima shouted. "Get out of this room now." But as he stood up, the floor suddenly sank beneath him. His body floated as if in zero gravity, and in an instant, he was pulled toward the ceiling. "Tajima-san!" Sato screamed, but even his voice began to fade away. Tajima's vision became severely distorted, and the voice from the other dimension grew louder and louder. What had started as a calm, cold sound gradually turned into a chaotic flood of noise, continuing in an ear-piercing, high-pitched ringing. Then, the moment his vision turned completely white, Tajima understood the meaning of that voice. "I found you." The voice was saying those very words. As Tajima's consciousness was completely dyed white, he felt it. The voice from the other dimension had finally entered directly into him. The ringing in his ears echoed like it was tearing through him, and he was enveloped in the sensation of space expanding endlessly. It felt as though he himself were being drawn into another dimension. "I found you." That voice now unmistakably echoed from within him. It was reverberating, like the beating of his own heart. And then, suddenly, everything was wrapped in silence. The distortion of space stopped, the cold disappeared, and only a vast whiteness spread around him. Tajima tried to move his body but couldn't move at all. Even though his eyes were open, he saw nothing. It felt as if he had been left alone in this white space. At that moment, the voice echoed again. "I am watching you." Those words carried a weight and an undeniable fear. Tajima felt a chill run down his spine. Something had been watching him all along. An existence from another dimension had been observing and monitoring him, focusing its attention solely on him. "Who are you?" Tajima asked, his throat trembling. But there was no answer. Instead, in the complete silence, his vision began to slowly come into focus. Tajima rubbed his eyes and gasped. Countless shadows were floating in front of him. They had no definite shape and kept changing form fluidly as they approached him. All of them felt like beings from another dimension, abstract yet overwhelmingly present. Tajima felt them inevitably closing in around him. "You should never have interfered with our world." The voice echoed again. It sounded both like a warning and a sneer. At that moment, Tajima realized, opening the door to another dimension using the observation device had been an incredibly dangerous act. Of course, he should have understood the risks, but his curiosity as a scientist had suppressed those warnings. And now, his mistake was taking form right before his eyes. "Observation is not enough," the voice continued with an even colder tone. "You have summoned us." Tajima held his head with trembling hands. The other dimension was supposed to exist solely to be observed. However, by opening that door, he had inadvertently summoned it. And now, he was being held accountable for that action. At that moment, the space around him began to distort violently once again. Tajima fell to his knees helplessly. There was no turning back now. The beings from another dimension had completely stepped into his world. The moment he shut his eyes in despair, the entire space collapsed, and in an instant, he was drawn into that other world. Afterward, the laboratory where Tajima had disappeared fell into complete silence, as if nothing had happened. Sato couldn't understand what had occurred, but he was certain he had heard the voice saying, "I found you." Soon after, the police came to investigate, but nothing suspicious was found. The only anomaly was that all the equipment in the lab had completely shut down. Eventually, the lab reopened, and months passed. Tajima's disappearance gradually became an urban legend outside the lab. But within the lab, the experiments continued. Although the signal from the other dimension that Tajima had seen had ceased, its influence hadn't completely vanished. The equipment resumed operation, continuously receiving faint signals. The scientists, while cautious, remained fascinated by the phenomenon. One day, the young researcher Sato sat in front of the monitor once again. Ever since that incident, he had been unable to forget the voice from the other dimension. He was certain it couldn't have been a mere auditory hallucination. Still, no matter how many times he checked, the signal remained faint. But that day, an anomaly appeared on the monitor. Again, Sato murmured. The signal from the other dimension was clearly displayed on the monitor. It sounded similar to the voice that once declared, "I found you," but this time was different. The waveform of the sound fluctuated with extreme intensity, as if it possessed emotions like a living creature. Why is this happening again? Realizing the anomaly, Sato unconsciously slammed his fist on the desk. At that moment, a single word appeared on the monitor. It looked like a regular handwriting drawn by a human hand. "Help." The word was flashing in red. Sato's hands trembled. He stared at the word as if he were cursed. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary word, but he felt there was some profound meaning hidden within it. What Tajima-san said about an interdimensional being interfering with us. Maybe it was true. Sato repeated the word displayed on the monitor in his head, trembling. "Help? Is an interdimensional being asking me for help?" However, he could not immediately understand its meaning. What exactly is this being from another dimension? Is it simply a mass of consciousness, or does it possess a form closely resembling that of a human? Either way, Trying to understand it might mean the end of this research. Despite his hesitation, Sato continued to track the signal. He didn't know what awaited him ahead. Even so, he felt he had no choice but to trust his intuition. A few hours later, the signal from the other dimension strengthened again, and finally, a new message appeared on the monitor. This time, its content echoed like a warning. "Don't come." The message seemed not just a warning but a direct threat aimed at Sato. Suddenly, the frequency of the signal fluctuated violently, and Sato felt something trying to interfere directly with his mind. He stood up and hurriedly walked around the lab. Unconsciously, his body grew cold, and his steps became unsteady. It wasn't just fear. He could feel that the interdimensional being was trying to influence him in some way. When the entrance door of the lab opened on its own, Sato anxiously stared beyond it. All he could see was a vast white silence. "There's no going back now," he muttered. But at that moment, something moved behind him. When Sato turned around, he saw what looked like a transparent human figure standing there. The expressionless shadow resembled a spirit without substance, merely staring intently at him. "Who are you?" Sato asked with a trembling voice. But the shadow remained silent, simply approaching him. As the shadow drew closer, Sato took a step back. Then, the shadow opened its mouth. "We can never go back to our worlds." The voice resembled that of the interdimensional one. Sato gasped, his body stiffened, and he involuntarily dropped to his knees. "You summoned us," the shadow said. "Now, you are a part of our world." Sato, overwhelmed by the words spoken by the shadow before him, desperately tried to regain his composure and think things through. While he understood that the being before him had undoubtedly come from another dimension, he was terrified by the implication of its words, "We can never go back." As a scientist, he couldn't abandon his professional curiosity, but in that very moment, the intuition he felt was turning into certainty. "This existence is not just an observation target but something actively interfering with my world. Why are you doing this?" Sato asked desperately. His voice trembled, but he fought hard to suppress his fear. The shadow continued to silently stare at Sato. Its gaze seemed to convey something and pressed heavily on Sato's chest. It felt as if the shadow was reading his thoughts. The boundary of existence was gradually becoming blurred. Eventually, the shadow slowly opened its mouth. "Observation is not enough." The words didn't sound like mere conversation, they resonated as a warning. Sato felt as if something had burst inside his head. He realized once again that what his observation device had captured was not just a series of data. The terrifying reality that the being possessed consciousness and was intentionally interfering with his world hit him hard. "Our world flows in a different time from here. The moment you observed us, we began to touch your world." The shadow's voice was cold, but it also contained sorrow. "We can no longer return. Because you opened that door." The shadow spoke and slowly approached Sato. Its steps seemed to distort the very space around it. Sato involuntarily shook his head at those words. "Then, are you saying that what I did summoned you here?" The shadow did not answer. Instead, it appeared to quietly tilt its head. Sato felt as if the being was speaking directly to his inner self. Even without uttering words, it was as if his thoughts were being reflected outward. "That observation triggered our contact with your world," the shadow continued. "But during that process, you did not understand how terrifying the influence we had on you would become." Sato pressed his trembling hand against his forehead. "Influence? What do you mean by that?" The shadow stared intently at Sato. Eventually, an image appeared before Sato's eyes. It was footage from past observations. He saw Tajima suffering, the signal from the other dimension gradually growing stronger, and eventually, the lab collapsing. That moment, Tajima was enveloped by the voice from the other dimension, and then vanished. "When you opened the door, something had already changed," the shadow said. And that influence did not end with Tajima alone. Sato's eyes widened as he stared at the footage. As Tajima disappeared, the interdimensional shadow spreading throughout the lab had begun to affect other objects as well. Space distorted, physical laws collapsed, and the boundary between dimensions became unstable. "That distortion is still continuing," the shadow said. "If you continue this, your world will gradually be absorbed by the other dimension and eventually completely merge." Sato was shocked by those words. The interdimensional beings were not merely objects of observation. They possessed the power to engulf this world as well. "We can no longer return," the shadow said quietly. "Therefore, there are only two paths for you to choose from." "Two paths?" Sato asked in surprise. "One is to release us." The shadow's voice grew slightly stronger. The other is for you to completely merge with us. The moment he heard those words, Sato felt terrified. Release? Merge? Both seemed like terrifying choices beyond his imagination. In either case, you have no choice. The shadow said. Its voice carried a tone of resignation. The path has already been decided. Sato felt a freezing sensation spread through his body at those words. No matter what decision he made, he could never go back. It felt as if this was already a predetermined fate. Sato was at a loss for words. The shadow before him simply stared quietly at him. Its presence was frighteningly cold and seemed to hold a strong conviction. Sato felt as if, no matter what choice he made, the outcome had already been decided. Release or merge? Sato whispered and turned his gaze toward the shadow. Either way, I must choose, right? The shadow nodded quietly for a brief moment. Its posture was calm, showing no sign of agitation. Then it slowly approached Sato and continued speaking. If you release us, you will return to your original world. All evidence of our existence will disappear, and everything will return to normal. As long as you do not attempt contact with the other dimension again, everything will be as if it never happened. However, for that, you must completely erase us. Sato listened quietly without reacting. The shadow continued further. To merge means for you and us to become one. The boundary of space will disappear, and the other dimension and reality will overlap and eventually fully merge. At that time, your existence will no longer belong to you alone, and a new world will begin. Sato repeated those words in his mind, holding his breath. Both choices were terrifying. Erasure through release meant completely wiping out the interdimensional existence. Moreover, it meant that Sato himself would have to enforce that. Merging meant distorting all the laws of physics, overlapping dimensions and reality, leading to infinite change and chaos. I want to return to my world, Sato said, but his voice lacked conviction. In his heart, there was no certainty anymore. Every option seemed impossible, filled only with infinite fear. The shadow briefly reacted to his answer but then quietly continued speaking. If you wish to return, erasure is inevitable. If you choose that, our world will gradually begin to collapse. Our reality will begin to take on an entirely different form. Time, space, and even us. Hearing those words, Sato instinctively backed away. He felt the space in front of him warping and turned his gaze away. He couldn't understand why he had to make such a choice. As a scientist who had challenged himself to understand and manipulate all laws, he now felt he was becoming part of those very laws. I can't possibly make such a heavy decision, Sato said. Then suddenly, something moved behind him. Who's there? Sato turned toward the entrance and cried out. But standing there was none other than an existence from the other dimension. A dark figure was approaching, distorting the space around it. Its eyes seemed not only cold but also tinged with a slight sense of compassion. The path you must choose will eventually be chosen, the shadow said in a low voice, taking another step forward. No matter which you choose, our world will continue to change. But you must choose. Sato felt as if his heart had stopped and exhaled deeply. He was fighting within himself, struggling to determine which choice was the right one. However, he sensed that there was something hidden in the words of the shadow before him. Perhaps by releasing them, the peaceful world could be restored. But that would mean completely erasing the other dimension. Moreover, there was no guarantee that the world would return to normal after the release. On the other hand, choosing to merge meant everything would overlap in a new form and change. It was certain that a new world would begin. Do I really have to choose? Sato asked. His eyes were on the verge of tears. The shadow remained silent and did not answer. Instead, the space distorted violently, and the power of the other dimension appeared before him. The overwhelmingly powerful force dominated the surroundings, and Sato was engulfed by that power. And at that moment, he made his decision. Merge, Sato whispered, closing his eyes. The boundary between the other dimension and reality disappeared, and the new dimension enveloped his heart and body. The next morning, Sato woke up and headed to the bathroom to brush his teeth, just like always. As he looked at his reflection in the mirror and lifted his toothbrush, he felt something strange about his own face in the mirror. When he opened his eyes wide, he saw a face that somehow resembled Tajima's staring back at him. That face moved as naturally as if it were his own. Sato realized it then. He had merged with Tajima. Now, two consciousnesses coexisted simultaneously within Sato's mind. Sato muttered, "So this is the new world."